In the shadows of ancient Rome, where power and politics intertwined with pleasure, events arose that would change history forever. But what really happened in those moments were luxury, eroticism, and strategy combined? Sexual parties in Rome were not just a private indulgence, they were a deeply political act, a way to assert power, consolidate alliances, and make it clear who was in control. But do we really understand what happened at these private parties of the Roman elite? Today, we will uncover the best-kept secrets of ancient Rome, beyond the myths and exaggerations. We'll explore how these events were a tool of power, and how sexuality was not just a desire, but a declaration of status and control. Don't leave, the best is yet to come. Ancient Rome was a deeply hierarchical society, where every action, every word, and even every desire had a meaning that reinforced its power structure. Sexuality, far from being a personal act, was regulated by strict social codes, and was used as a language to demonstrate status, control, and dominance. In Rome, pleasure was not prohibited, but it was always framed within well-defined limits. Desires could be expressed, yes, but under the supervision of established hierarchies. Free citizens of high status could enjoy these pleasures, but they always had to maintain their image of authority. The fundamental principle was clear: in Rome, the man must always be the one in control, never the one controlled. Sexuality, therefore, was a strategic tool. Instead of being a simple act of desire, it transformed into a declaration of power and control, a game that went beyond intimacy. Here, power was not limited to controlling weapons, but also controlling another's body. Sexual parties in Rome were not an isolated phenomenon. Other ancient cultures also adopted similar rituals, though for different purposes and meanings. In Greece, for example, symposia were events where food, wine, and conversation flowed freely, but they also served to honor the gods and discuss political life. However, in Rome, these banquets took on a much more strategic dimension. While the Greeks used pleasure to celebrate fertility and art, the Romans transformed these gatherings into a tool of political and social power. In Egypt, fertility rituals were also closely tied to power. However, in Rome, eroticism became a visual and symbolic language used to consolidate the authority of high-class free men, using pleasure not only as enjoyment but as a public declaration of status. Rome didn't just adopt these rituals, it adapted them to its own hierarchical structure, using the body as a means to manifest power, not just to experience pleasure. One of the first to institutionalize these banquets full of pleasure and power was Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose name has been etched in history for his rise to power during the final years of the Roman Republic. Sulla, in his quest to consolidate his power, introduced the so-called convivia libidinosa in the circles of the Roman aristocracy. These banquets were not just simple parties. It wasn't just about eating and drinking, every detail was carefully designed to underline the host's power. Inspired by Hellenistic customs, Sulla combined food and wine with erotic spectacles, sensual dances, and the presence of professional courtesans. These events were a mix of entertainment and humiliation. Guests not only enjoyed the party, but also witnessed acts that consolidated hierarchy: who organized, who owned, who decided. Roman sexual parties were not spontaneous events, they were carefully organized celebrations, reserved for the elites, where every detail had a purpose. These banquets took place in private and exclusive locations, away from the curious eyes of the city, in rural villas or luxurious urban residences, often decorated with erotic frescoes and suggestive mosaics. Suburban villas, in particular, offered privacy and the perfect environment for these events. They were equipped with enclosed gardens, private pools, and rooms decorated with explicit scenes, some of which have survived to this day in Pompeii and Herculaneum. These frescoes depicted images of gods, satyrs, and nymphs in provocative postures, a visual representation of desire and fertility that only the most powerful could afford. The participants in these banquets were mostly high-status free men, senators, generals, magistrates. Accompanied by musicians, slaves, and trained courtesans, These events combined pleasure with power, entertaining the guests with sensual dances and explicit performances that had a clear message. Domination and control were key to the Roman elite. These parties were not just a means to enjoy pleasure, but a space where power was staged explicitly. Every gesture, every glance, every word had a clear purpose: to reinforce social hierarchies, show who dominated, and who was dominated. Eroticism became a nonverbal language, a tool to demonstrate status, humiliate enemies, or seduce potential allies. It was a way of expressing power, of showing that not only were bodies controlled, but also the fate of Rome. At the most exclusive banquets, sexual scenes featuring slaves or performers not only aimed to impress, but to send a clear message: here, the one who organizes, who possesses, who decides, commands. Sexuality, therefore, was much more than a private act. It was a public spectacle, a constant affirmation of who was at the top of the social pyramid. Slaves played an essential role in these feasts. They were not merely assistants or witnesses, but fundamental pieces in the power dynamics represented at every banquet. Rome's sexual and social hierarchy was so intrinsically tied to these rituals that even the slaves were active participants in the representation. The slaves involved in these events were mostly trained courtesans, actors, and musicians who knew exactly how to perform their roles to meet the hosts' and guests' expectations. In a context where power was exercised through domination, these slaves became vehicles to transmit authority and control. But the relationship with the slaves was not limited to participation in the shows. They represented an element of subordination, a palpable demonstration of the difference between the elite and those considered property. Sexuality at these events, therefore, did not only involve a play of pleasure, but a clear demonstration of control, where the bodies of the slaves served as a tool to affirm the power of free and high-class Romans. With the rise of emperors to power, Roman sexual parties took on a new dimension, directly linked to absolute power. What had previously been an exclusive privilege of the aristocracy, became a public manifestation of imperial power. Emperors like Tiberius, Caligula, and Nero used these events not only to satisfy private desires but as a way to reaffirm their dominance. In this new context, the parties were no longer just private acts, but a spectacle where the emperor presented himself to his people as the absolute owner of both his own and others' bodies. Tiberius, for example, retired to his villa on Capri, where, according to historians' accounts, he organized banquets so decadent and extreme that even Roman standards seemed surpassed. There, surrounded by young slaves and courtesans, Tiberius elevated eroticism to a political level, turning pleasure into another tool to consolidate his power. The abuse of eroticism as a declaration of authority reached its peak under the reign of Caligula. The emperor, known for his excesses, used these parties to humiliate his enemies, force the presence of political figures, and showcase his total control over all aspects of Roman life, even the most intimate. While Tiberius and Caligula laid the foundations for the abuse of power through eroticism, it was Nero who took sexual parties to a theatrical and completely scandalous level. Emperor from 54 to 68 AD, Nero transformed his celebrations into true dramatic representations of desire. He did not limit himself to simple banquets. His parties were water processions along the Tiber River, where the emperor would appear surrounded by musicians, actors, and prostitutes, all participating in what could be considered a circus of excess. Raths decorated as floating brothels were the perfect setting for boundless ostentation, where pleasure became a public spectacle. In addition to these banquets, Nero celebrated simulated weddings with his lovers, whether men or women, in complete ceremonies with witnesses and rituals. In his famous residence, the Domus Aurea, he held endless feasts where rose petals and perfumes rained down on the guests while participants surrendered to sensuality without any moderation. Nero not only sought pleasure for himself, but used these acts as a public affirmation of his absolute power. Eroticism, in his case, was a tool to assert his dominance over Rome, where control over the bodies of others translated into control over the empire's destiny. Although these parties were seen as a symbol of power and ostentation, not everyone in Rome approved of these excesses. In intellectual and philosophical circles, figures like Seneca and Cicero openly criticized the decadence represented by these banquets. Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, saw these practices as a manifestation of Rome's moral corruption, a decadence that overflowed the limits of self-control and virtue. Cicero, for his part, also condemned these acts, seeing them as a threat to the social order and Roman morality. The criticism did not only come from the intellectual elite. Many Romans from lower classes viewed these banquets as an unsustainable excess, while senators, for example, found themselves caught between the pressure to participate in these events as a way of consolidating their power, and the public image expected of them in their political roles. However, despite the criticism, the importance of these parties in Roman politics cannot be underestimated. Emperors often used these events as a tool to strengthen their power base, humiliate their enemies, or even divert attention from political failures. The hypocrisy of this behavior, both private and public, was a recurring theme in Roman debates. Sexual parties in Rome were much more than a simple escape from reality or a private indulgence. They were a reflection of the deep contradictions within Roman society, which seemed to embrace excess in privacy, but at the same time demanded strict public morality. In a world where honor and discipline were essential for social survival, the same people who enjoyed these luxurious and pleasurable banquets maintained a public image of virtue, decorum, and honor. Senators, generals, and nobles could participate in these acts, but outside of these private circles, they had to adhere to strict codes of conduct and maintain a facade of respect and control. This contrast between private permissiveness and public moral rigidity reflects one of the most surprising characteristics of ancient Rome. While the elites indulged in these excesses, Roman morality demanded a decent public life, creating a double standard that persisted throughout the history of the empire. Despite the secret nature of Roman sexual parties, their cultural impact was not limited to the elites. These celebrations and their excesses left a deep mark on Roman literature, especially in satire and erotic poetry, where authors like Ovid, Martial, and Petronius not only described explicit scenes but also reflected on the boundaries between legitimate desire and moral decay. In their works, the Romans not only discussed pleasure and excess but also the social and political consequences of these acts. How far could men of power go in their pursuit of pleasure without losing their dignity? How did these intimate acts impact the social and political balance of Rome? These questions were debated on the pages of great Roman writers, leading to a constant dialogue about morality and corruption. Eroticism, therefore, was not just an escape from reality, but a way to question and affirm the social order, sometimes openly, sometimes subtly, leaving future generations a legacy that would go beyond the celebrations themselves, becoming a constant reflection on power, desire, and morality. Although Roman sexual parties may seem like a relic of a past era, their lessons remain relevant today. In many ways, the dynamics of power, control, and desire that dominated these events echo in our current society, where sexuality continues to be a tool of power and domination in various spheres. Today, public representations of pleasure, control over other people's bodies, and the pursuit of status through indulgence still persist in public and private discourse. Roman parties teach us how sexuality, far from being merely a personal act, can be used to consolidate power, influence politics, and reinforce social hierarchies. Looking back, we might ask, to what extent do our own social and political practices still reflect these ancient Roman rituals? What lessons can we learn from the way Rome used eroticism to assert control over its citizens and the known world? Sexual parties in ancient Rome show us much more than just indulgence in desire. They were a complex manifestation of power, control, and hierarchy, where pleasure became a political and social tool, carefully staged to affirm the status of the most powerful. But beyond the excesses and historical dramatizations, these rituals reveal a fundamental aspect of Roman society, the constant struggle for control, power, and influence, not only on the battlefield but also in the most intimate moments of daily life. Today, looking back, we can reflect on how desire, power, and politics intertwine in surprising ways and how these old rituals continue to resonate in our modern society, albeit in more subtle forms. If this hidden side of Rome intrigued you, subscribe to the channel and join us in the next chapter, where we will unravel more secrets of ancient Rome. Because understanding these parties is not about looking with morbid curiosity, but with memory. History, even in its excess, reveals who we were and who we still are.